This is a video that I think will be very relevant to pretty much anyone in North America or in Europe as we sort of move away from the middle of the winter and towards warmer, brighter spring weather. As many of us in our different states, provinces, regions in the world think about, okay, when do we reopen? When do we start getting back to normal life? And I want to contrast a couple of regions on the planet. One would be the perfect example of this, obviously, would be Florida, where they have been very critical of any restrictions. I'm going to summarize them by saying the word lockdown, even if lockdown is not always the perfect word for every COVID restriction that has been enforced. But I'll just say they're critical of lockdowns. And the region where I live in Canada, called Quebec, where we have been, in general, very supportive of the fairly strong restrictions and lockdowns that we've had for a number of months now. And the basic question I've been asking myself is, at what point does our general willingness to adhere to what the government tells us to do become harmful? Because in general, in Quebec, and more generally in Canada, with the possible exception of Alberta, which is a sort of the Texas of Canada, we've been very supportive of all the restrictions and the lockdown measures that have been imposed on us. If you ask most people in the street in Quebec, they're going to tell you, yes, we should lock down, we need to save lives, et cetera, which is not in and of itself unreasonable. And I'm not trying to say that those opinions are wrong. And what you see now, more recently, as sort of the pandemic for the past month or so has been dying down, case numbers are down, hospitalizations and deaths are down, not just here, not just in Florida, but across most of the planet, is that people are starting to change their opinion. They're going from being, yes, I think we need to have more lockdown, to I'm not really happy with what is going on and I'm not really sure how to express it. I'm just sort of generally frustrated at what's been happening. Whereas in Florida, the perfect counter example, you seem to have a lot of people who have been very vocal about including to a certain extent the governor of Florida, very vocal about their opposition to these measures for quite a while now. And it made me think, we as humans are not robots. Our opinions don't change in a binary fashion. Or if they do, the way we act, at the very least, is not binary. You have people who, like probably the vast majority of people in the developed world, in March of last year, were extremely pro-lockdown because they didn't know if this disease was going to kill 5% of the population and everyone they love, and we didn't know anything about anything, so people were generally very in favor of heavy restrictions for a certain amount of time. And over time, that support has waned. It's waned to different degrees, to different extents in different regions, certainly more in Florida than it has, say, here. But in general, when I look at the people who are remaining in my social circle or generally on social media communities for Quebec or for Canada, we see that this support for the lockdown has been going down steadily, bit by bit. The first time I ever saw anyone express any critical sentiments towards the lockdown was probably in early November, when we entered our second month of essentially no fun, no socializing, no sports, restaurants, nada. And at this point, it's getting to the level where you might have almost a 50-50 split between people who want us to continue the measures and people who want us not to. It probably even tipped more past that, as just today our head of province announced or sort of leaked out that he is considering continuing the restrictions that we're seeing, which includes right now a curfew at 8 p.m. The police can fine you if you're outside of your house without a good reason after 8 p.m. Into about mid-March. So the question is, if, I'm not saying this is necessarily the case, but it's a big if, the lockdowns have no longer been helping us, and that right now we should be reopening our society and getting rid of the restrictions, we can only go about doing that and pressuring the government to do so if we have a large percentage of our population normal people who are fed up with the restrictions and who are willing to go out there and voice their opinion. But it is hard to get to that point when we have been so compliant so far with the restrictions. Because, as I mentioned before, we're not binary. So people who started being very pro-lockdown then sort of became somewhat pro, but with some inhibitions about it, some hesitancies. Then they became sort of in the middle where they didn't know what they believed. And then they moved towards being mildly against it, but not really being certain what should be lifted and what should be kept in place. And then some of them continue on to be very strongly anti-lockdown. You have this whole continuum, and over time, over the past year, we've seen people move from that very pro slowly towards the very anti-lockdown position. But because we started so strongly in that one side, it's not like we had a lot of people who were right in the middle. We had a huge majority of our population in all these surveys and polls that were done essentially saying that they would, restrictions may have to be kept for 2 more years, or we might have to do this and that, or we should be handing out huge, severe fines to anyone who's caught doing any kind of infraction against what is supported by the state. And it actually hinders our ability, potentially, to make the right decision later on and start pushing our government to reopen. If it is right now that we start reopening as we move away from the middle of winter and it becomes more and more clear that there's no realistic chance that our hospitals will be overwhelmed, since one, the days are getting longer and warmer, and we know right now that it's somewhat seasonal in terms of the virus, and 2, we have more and more people vaccinated, so we have fewer people who are at risk. And 3, the case numbers themselves have been going down recently, so we're getting further away from that extreme high level of cases. And we have all these factors coming together that perhaps suggest that we should be reopening our society. But you don't see many people voicing that. I mean, at the very least on my social media, I don't have very many people at all expressing any strong sentiment about why the lockdown should not continue or why XYZ should be reopened. And it's probably because it takes a long time for us to get to that point where we're able to vocally oppose something. I mean, if you look back in history, many times we had people where we had situations where a majority of the society may in theory be against something, but they're simply not vocal enough about it to actually make a change. And it took something to push them towards that position where they started to actually go out there and storm the Bastille or whatever it was that required them to, that allowed them to make the change in society that they wanted to see. Whereas in Florida, that state that we like to make fun of so often for being full of stereotypically uneducated hicks, at least here in Canada, we might see a return to normal faster, and in particular, a safe return to normal. When we look back at last year in Quebec, where I live, I was unable to play an outdoor team sport, not organized, not in the league or anything, just with friends sort of in a park, until it was something around late June. So until then, we had city employees with tape going around and barring off all the different equipment or areas where you might be playing such a sport. And a couple of times I was stopped by city employees and they said, they didn't fine me or anything, but they said, hey, you can't do that. It's illegal. And we now know that that was probably very unnecessary. For one, we know that if you're outside, you don't transmit the virus. In the summer or in the late spring when it's 20 degrees, you're unlikely to have, I don't know, whatever it is, the caseload seems to drop considerably. So the question is now for societies, for communities like my own, are we going to wait until July before we decide to open things back up? Are we going to wait until we have such tiny caseloads and tiny hospitalizations that the chance of hospitals being overwhelmed drops from 1% to 0.001%? Should we even? I'm not even saying this is necessarily the case that we should do this. But whatever it is, because we have been so pro one position for so long, it takes us a long time to shift to that other position. And I don't know how many people, ordinary people who aren't crazy and wearing Trump or QAnon flags, are going to be going out in the street and pushing for reasonable lifting of restrictions in the near future. Because most of us now have only gotten halfway there. Most of us have only gone from being very pro to being in the middle and uncertain or vaguely unhappy with the restrictions. And in a way, it can actually be damaging to have such a strong position before about whether we should have restrictions or not, because it's now going to take us so long to get to the point where we actually push our government, and it seems likely that we have to push our government to make the right decision to open up. Anyway, those are just the thoughts that I had today about the whole COVID situation. Feel free to tell me what you think. Thank you.